The perpetual struggle against Count Dracula continues. Castlevania Advance Collection brings together 4 classic Castlevania games with deathly beautiful graphics and hauntingly epic music.
Well, that's convenient. The following video is a collection of all 3 reviews I did on the Castlevania games for the Game Boy Advance. I figured it'd be handy to have all 3 single reviews together in one video for your viewing pleasure. I'll be including timestamps in the description if you want to skip to a particular game. This video will not contain my review of Symphony of the Night, but you can check that out here. Enjoy! Well guys, I'd say it's high time we return to the monster-infested corridors of Castlevania. When we last tackled this series, we took a look at the major paradigm shift from level-based side-scrolling action platformer to a more sprawling, open-ended style of game with RPG elements that producer Koji Igarashi would label as the search action genre, and us Yanks would label as Metroidvania. Castlevania Symphony of the Night would go on to be so critically and commercially successful that Igarashi-sensei would be appointed by Konami as producer of the entire series going forward. And now that we've gotten one of the most celebrated entries in the series out of the way, I would now like to turn your attention to the 3 games succeeding it, the Castlevania games for Game Boy Advance. And frankly, these 3 games are the ones I was really chomping at the bits to make reviews on, because these are the ones that got me into the Castlevania series. And whenever I see people mention this series, I almost never hear these 3 games get mentioned. And that's a real shame because I honestly think that these 3 are some of the best the series has to offer in terms of the Metroidvania-style games. So I'd like to give them their fair due. 1997's Symphony of the Night would go on to be so well received that Konami was keen to replicate its success by having future installments follow its gameplay structure, putting the player in one large castle to explore gradually as opposed to individual levels in the style of the NES and Super NES games. Though for as influential as Igarashi-sensei would be to the series going forward, him and his development team at Konami's Tokyo studio would actually not be involved in this next title. Instead, the reins were given to Konami's Kobe department, who beforehand had worked on the Nintendo 64 titles, the first of which was not particularly well received. That sounds like a recipe for disaster, having the team behind one of the worst received games in the series tackle the next mainline game. But what we actually ended up with is what I consider one of the most underrated entries in the series. The Game Boy Advance launch title, and my first Castlevania game, 2001's Castlevania Circle of the Moon. The year is 1830, and the Lord of Darkness, Count Dracula, has spent the last 10 years sealed away in a magic casket. One of Dracula's vampire minions, Camilla, no, not Carmilla this time, has brought the casket he's been sealed inside to her castle in Austria to revive him. Mere seconds after Dracula is released, Morris Baldwin, the vampire killer who sealed him away 10 years ago, arrives with his son Hugh and his apprentice Nathan Drake. God damn it, that's the second time now. Nathan Graves. Dracula is still weak, his powers having faded in the 10 years he's spent sealed away, but before our heroes can use this to their advantage and get the upper hand on him, Dracula destroys the floor underneath Nathan and Hugh, leaving Morris behind with him. Somehow, Nate and Hugh's legs don't shatter from the fall, and Hugh runs off in a mad dash to take out Dracula before he can regain his former power, urging Nate to stay out of his way. Wanting to save Morris as much as Hugh does, the game begins as you trek across Camilla's castle. So yeah, a little bit of a minor change-up this time around, but you're not actually exploring Dracula's castle, but rather Camilla's. That doesn't make it any less dangerous, though, as there are monsters everywhere. This is a Castlevania game, after all. Despite this castle not belonging to the Count, it does contain many of the same types of locations as the one in Symphony. You've got your catacombs, long hallways, a clock tower-style area, cathedral, areas that have become iconic to the franchise without it feeling like a complete rehash of Symphony. The castle isn't as large as the one found in Symphony, more than likely due to the portable nature of the game, but it contains enough variety in its design and enemy selection that it remains pretty engaging to explore, at least in my opinion. Speaking of its design, I gotta say, for a GBA game in 2001, a launch game no less, this is a really good looking game. Again, it's an obvious downgrade visually from Symphony. There's no polygons or particle effects, and the animation might be a bit limited in comparison, but the areas are still very rich and detailed for a 2D game with sprite-based graphics. Even now, 20 years later, the graphics are still charming in their own way. Though, if you're playing this game on an original Game Boy Advance system, the game's dark graphics do come with a price. Before the time when screens with backlights became the standard, playing this game in particular with the original GBA's dim screen was something of a challenge, as it was very difficult to see anything. Now granted, this is a complete non-issue today if you're playing this on, say, a DS or on the Wii U's Virtual Console, but this was a pretty widespread criticism of the game back when it first released. Hell, I should know, my first time playing this was on an original non-backlit GBA, and I can personally attest that it was hard to see things at times without proper lighting right next to me. What I can say is an improvement visually over Symphony is that you get a health meter right over your magic meter as opposed to a number. It's a small change, sure, but I found this game's health meter to be much more helpful at a glance when I needed to see how much health I had left, instead of a number tucked all the way over to the top left-hand side of the screen. Circle of the Moon has good visual presentation, but it's definitely not lacking in the sound department either. Out of all three games on the GBA, heck, maybe even all of the post-Symphony games, I think Circle of the Moon may actually have my personal favorite soundtrack. Many, if not all, of the songs in this game are incredibly well-done renditions of classic tracks from the series' old games. This game has my absolute favorite versions of the Sinking Old Sanctuary and Vampire Killer. Every single song in this game is amazing. I just love it. Bosses tend to guard an item that enables you to perform new abilities like the double jump, the ability to jump off of walls, and the high jump. And using these new abilities to reach previously unreachable areas is how you progress through the game, as is typically the case with these Metroidvanias. The thrill of finding new areas as you gain these new abilities is still very much alive and well here. I slightly touched on this already, but it helps that these areas are detailed and varied, and the soundtrack definitely amplifies its dark atmosphere. I'll still defend this game's visuals to this day, even 20 years later. God, 20 years. I'm getting old. What hasn't aged disgracefully are the controls. They're a bit on the stiff side. For starters, for the first 5 or so minutes of the game, you can't even run, until you find a special item that allows you to do so. Running is done by pressing left or right on the D-pad twice. It's weird and kinda unnecessary, but once you get used to it, it's not so bad. It's just kind of a confusing design choice. Despite there being no reference to any of the members of House Belmont, Nate still comes equipped with a whip as his primary weapon. Gone from Symphony in the Night are the types of weapons like swords, axes, staves, and knuckle dusters, but you can enchant your whip or turn it into different types of weapons. More on that in a bit. The number of sub-weapons from Symphony has also been cut down to just 5. For me, it isn't a huge problem because I really only stuck to a couple in Symphony, but I still think it's worth mentioning. But that won't be the only arsenal you'll be playing with, as this game introduces a new mechanic called the Dual Setup System, or DSS for short. Every so often, when slaying a specific enemy, they'll drop a purple card. There are 20 of these in the game, 10 action cards and 10 attribute cards. Combining an action card on the top row with an attribute card on the bottom row and activating its ability with the left trigger will grant you either a magical ability or an immense stat boost. Using these consumes your MP, but it'll slowly regenerate when not using any magic. So while you technically can use other weapons than the whip if you're using the right card setup, it uses MP every time you use them, so it's not quite the same as it is in Symphony, or some of the later games in the series. There's definitely a level of experimentation that comes into play when combining these cards together, and that adds to the overall fun of the game, in my opinion. These DSS cards are only held by certain enemies, which appear in specific parts of the castle, and you're bound to find a handful of them playing through the game normally, but if you want to find all 20 of them, you might want to break out that online walkthrough. And even then, you may be killing the same type of enemy over and over again before it finally drops. I don't feel like you'd really need all 20 DSS cards in order to get through the game, but there are some super helpful abilities you gain from them. Not only can enemies drop these DSS cards, but restorative items like potions and mine restores can also be farmed from fallen enemies. But because enemies drop them so rarely if you're not boosting your luck stat, they can be a pain to farm when you're running low on them. And not having enough of them can make boss fights pretty hard. Certainly doesn't help that out of the 3 GBA games, this one's got some of the toughest boss fights. Now you're probably asking, why don't you just buy some potions then? Symphony of the Night let you do it. Well, unfortunately, in a rather surprising move for a post-Symphony game, the one immediately following it no less, there are no shops in this game. There's no gold or currency of any kind, so you either have to farm healing items from specific enemies, make liberal use of your save points, which do fully heal you, or rely on a specific DSS combination to heal yourself if you found the correct cards to use it. I did notice that this game tries to compensate for this by sprinkling in HP max increases fairly frequently, which does restore all your health, but it is jarring to see a post-Symphony game without easy access to healing items. Bosses don't even drop that red orb that fully heals you when you beat them in this game. I honestly don't know if this was an intentional design choice or not, so you're gonna have to try and not play this recklessly. Not having a reliable way to heal yourself aside from making a mad dash back to the save points does make this game a lot harder than it probably should have been. I know when I was younger, it took me a very long time to finish this game because I didn't have a reliable way to heal aside from save points. So you may have to do a little level grinding here and there. You also can't sell anything either. So you'll end up with like 5 or 6 leather armors or something, but since you can only equip one body armor of any kind at a time, you'll just have a bunch of extras that you can't do anything with. You can equip a set of arm-type armor for each of your arms, so that makes sense to have multiple, but in that case, anything more than 2 is just excessive. Though, if you are feeling particularly cheeky, you could exploit a rather infamous glitch this game contains, where activating one of your available DSS combinations, then quickly pausing the game to switch over to cards you haven't collected yet, can activate an ability you wouldn't normally otherwise have, like, say, the really good healing spell. I didn't do this during my first 2 playthroughs, mainly because I didn't know this glitch existed, but I was still able to beat the game. I don't recall farming a lot for high potions, nor had I unlocked the healing spell legit, so it's totally possible to beat the game without it, but having purchasable healing items would have made the overall game so much more manageable. Alright, I've banged on enough about that. I guess complaining about difficulty in a Castlevania game is like going outside in a heavy thunderstorm and then complaining that you got drenched. I'm honestly kinda in a tough spot with this game. I want to recommend it so badly because what this game does do right, it does it really right. I know this game probably won't be for everybody, and I may even be more than a little biased since this was my first Castlevania game, but I still find the core gameplay to be a lot of fun. The atmosphere and soundtrack are flat out amazing, and the DSS mechanic is a lot of fun to screw around with, even if finding the cards in the first place can be a bit of a pain in the ass. Not to mention, it has some of my favorite boss designs in the series, and I genuinely still think that even 20 years later, the game looks great. Aesthetically speaking, it's one of my favorite games ever. I may recommend you check out the other 2 GBA games first, just because of all the gameplay tweaks that were made in those entries, and because this game isn't particularly too beginner-friendly. I know I keep bringing this up, but if this game had handled its inventory management differently and actually had purchasable healing items and equipment, it'd be more than enough for me to give this game more than just a cautious recommendation to series newcomers. I know I refer to this game as one of the most underrated in the series, and I still stand by that, but I'm also well aware of the design choices that hold it back from being a game that everyone can really enjoy. While loose cartridges for less than $30 are still floating around on eBay, it's also readily available as a digital download on the Wii U's Virtual Console, which is how I captured footage for this video. For one last little history lesson, when Koji Igarashi took over production of the series in 2002, several Castlevania games were retroactively removed from the series' official timeline. Circle of the Moon was among them, later being referred to by Igarashi as a side story. Despite that, though, this game would go on to be a critical and commercial success, and the first Castlevania game to sell over 1 million copies. Igarashi would return full-time to the series with the next game released the following year, 2002's Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance. And how does that game fare with Symphony of the Night's acclaimed producer back in control of the series? Well, when we return to the Castlevania series, we'll see for ourselves. Well, last time we visited the Castlevania series, it was with the 2001 Game Boy Advance launch title, Circle of the Moon. Honestly, I may have gone a little easy on it in that review because it was the first game in the series I ever bought and played to completion, but more than anything, what I hope you took away from that review was, even with its stiff controls, lack of a reliable source of healing items, and the game's fairly high difficulty, that underneath it all, there's still a game in there that's definitely worth checking out. With Castlevania cementing itself as a viable series for the Game Boy Advance with Circle of the Moon, Konami sought to expand on the success of both it and the search action subgenre as best they could. And what better way to do that than to bring in the man who helped popularize it himself, Koji Igarashi. It was with the sophomore GBA entry, 2002's Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance, that Igarashi-sensei was appointed by Konami to be the producer of the Castlevania series going forward. Not only that, but development was reverted back to Konami's Tokyo studio, who had handled Symphony of the Night, rather than their Kobe studio, who developed the previous game, Circle of the Moon. Now, as for myself, I didn't actually play this one when it originally came out in 2002. I was actually playing Circle of the Moon around that time, and by the time I had finished it and wanted to play this, it became harder to find for some reason. It wouldn't be until 2006 when both this and the next game in the series, Aria of Sorrow, got bundled together in the Castlevania Double Pack, that I finally got a chance to play it. I received it as a birthday present that year, and that's when I finally got a chance to play both these games. And by then I had already played and finished Aria's sequel on the DS. The footage you're going to be seeing for this video is from the 2014 eShop release on the Nintendo Wii U. And with that, let's get into it. Harmony of Dissonance takes place in the year 1748, 50 years after Simon Belmont had vanquished the Curse of Dracula in Castlevania II's Best Ending, meaning that this game's story, chronologically, is set between the events of Castlevania II and Rondo of Blood. And since Castlevania II's Best Ending is considered the canon ending, Simon Belmont would live on, and House Belmont would be succeeded by Simon's grandson, Justy Belmont. What? It's pronounced juiced? Juiced. Yeah, apparently his name in French means just, or righteous. Okay. So anyway, 50 years have passed since Simon Belmont vanquished Dracula and scattered his remains to prevent him from being risen again. Juiced's best friend, Maxim... No, not that Maxim. Returns after spending 2 years on a training expedition, badly wounded and missing huge chunks of his memories. And with startling news. Their childhood friend, a girl named Lydia, has been kidnapped and is being held hostage in a mysterious castle that's randomly appeared out of thin air. Wasting no time, Juiced and Maxim head for the castle to rescue Lydia. Unbeknownst to them, they're about to stumble into something much larger. The game's plot starts off pretty basic, but since it ties pretty closely with one of the game's most prominent gimmicks, I'll touch on that part some more later in the video. One thing you're sure to notice right away when you start playing is just how much smoother and responsive the controls are. Gone is that stiffness and heaviness from the previous game, and in its place, a lighter, fluid, and more agile protagonist. This feels like a direct response to those who weren't a fan of how Circle of the Moon controlled, because this is a night and day difference. A new feature they implemented is the ability to dash using the GBA's shoulder buttons. The left shoulder button makes you dash left, and the right shoulder button right. And that's no matter which way on the screen your character is facing, meaning you can do a backdash as well. And, as you might imagine, since it's faster than your default movement speed, it makes getting around Dracula's castle much quicker and easier. Not only that, but you can also attack enemies and quickly backdash away from them to avoid oncoming attacks, so, as you might imagine, it's super useful. What's weird is that this is the only game where you can do that. The next game still has a backdash, but no forward dash, which was a bit of an odd exclusion if you ask me. You'd think a little convenient method of traversal like this would have been a permanent addition to this series going forward, but I guess not. As was the case with Circle of the Moon, your weapon of choice is the whip. Though since you're playing as an actual Belmont this time around, you'll be using the legendary Vampire Killer Whip in all its chain-link glory. You're even given that old ability to flail it around by holding down the attack button. In addition to the Vampire Killer, the series' trademark sub-weapons are also back. But if, for whatever reason, playing with these sub-weapons as they are is too boring for you, Harmony of Dissonance introduces a new mechanic called Spell Fusion. Throughout the castle, there are elemental books scattered around. Activating these and using your sub-weapons will either enhance it, or give you a whole new ability based on whatever sub-weapon you're using. It's pretty similar to Rondo of Blood's Item Crash ability, or Circle of the Moon's dual system setup mechanic. There are 30 possible types of spell fusion combinations, so you're bound to find a few favorites here. Some of the possible combinations just do a disgusting amount of damage to enemies. More on that later. This being a Metroidvania, that standard formula of exploring the castle and using keys and special abilities that are earned later to explore new areas is very much present and accounted for. These new abilities are unlocked by finding relics, some of which are out in the open, and some of them guarded by bosses. These new abilities can range from a double jump, a high jump that's implemented by hitting a certain button combination, and the ability to slide underneath low platforms. Not sure why you can't slide naturally and need a whole relic to do that, but then again, you couldn't even run in Circle of the Moon without a relic, so who am I to judge? Along the way, you'll also find Dracula's 6 remains scattered around, and these give you permanent stat boosts and permanent resistances to things like poison or curse attacks. It's definitely worth it just for that alone, but they also play into the game's plot. More on that later. And also, just like previous games, you'll be able to find permanent HP and heart counter increases. So not only is this game a lot easier to control, the truth is, I found that this is just a much easier game overall than Circle of the Moon. One of the biggest reasons why is the fact that this game has an actual merchant this time around, thank God. You can actually buy not only healing items, but armor and accessories as well. You can't sell any extras, you can only sell gemstones you find inside the castle, but money's generally not too big of an issue to come across, especially if you have the Greed Amulet accessory equipped, which jacks up the amount of money you find and turns certain areas in the castle into great money farming spots. And as a result, you'll be able to drip feed yourself potions throughout the course of the game and end up with some of the higher tier armor and accessories pretty early on. Now granted, where the merchant appears in certain rooms is dependent on certain requirements you have to fulfill, like needing to be at an odd-numbered level or having a certain item in your inventory, but chances are you'll run into him anyway just by playing normally. And while I would have preferred the merchant stay in one reliable, easy-to-find place instead of being at the mercy of some incredibly specific conditions being met, I definitely still prefer this over no merchant at all, as was the case in Circle of the Moon. And even without the merchant, the placement of healing items is a lot more generous than it was before too. I had no issue keeping myself alive in the early areas before ever finding the merchant, thanks to the more generous item placement and the better controls. And hell, beating bosses this time around actually drops that little orb thing that fully heals you. Something that definitely would have helped in the last game. Now I'd like to take a moment or two to talk about the aesthetics. In my opinion, the 3 Castlevania games were always some of the best looking games on the GBA, and for as much as I praise the graphics and art direction of Circle of the Moon, I simply can't deny that Harmony is definitely a big improvement overall. Not only are the sprite sizes much larger, but the areas are much more detailed, and there's more fluid animations as well. More of the larger enemies have individually animated limbs, and hell, some of the visual effects present in the backgrounds are pretty damn stunning for a GBA game in 2002. Although I did run into one occasion of the frame rate slowing down because of there being a lot of action on screen, but it didn't last very long, and it only ever happened to me that one time, and I just figured it'd be worth mentioning anyway. As I keep mentioning, the game was originally released in 2002, a time right before GBAs with lit screens were widely available or even existed yet. So Konami made an extra effort to make the game's colors brighter and easier to see on the old dark GBA screens, as this was one of the largest complaints levied against Circle of the Moon. I actually got curious and decided to test my physical GBA copy and my old Glacier Blue Game Boy Advance, and comparing the two games, yeah, Harmony of Dissonance is definitely a lot easier on the eyes compared to Circle of the Moon. But now that we have larger lit screens and, hell, other versions of both games available to us, I absolutely do not recommend playing either game on an old school GBA. Those screens were insanely dark, and I cannot believe we actually put up with it back then. I first played this game on a DS though, so luckily I didn't have to suffer. Though for as much extra detail and for as many improvements that they put into the graphics, this sort of came at the cost of the quality of the game's music. Having a lower quality sounding soundtrack is something that Harmony of Dissonance has become sort of infamous for. Apparently the reason for the music sounding like something from an NES game is because of space limitations after all the improvements to the visuals were made. As a result, what we have here is more chiptune sounding music. That may sound like a major downgrade over Circle of the Moon, and in some ways it kinda is, but personally, I find the actual compositions themselves to be great. The game's music is a major divisive topic for fans of the series, but I find myself in the camp of people who love it. I still think there's a lot to like about the music here. Since we're on the topic of aesthetics, we're going to need to circle back over to the plot of the game, as this does tie in pretty closely to the aesthetics. As you progress through the castle, you may notice that Maxim occasionally acts a little strangely when you run into him. The reason for this is that when Maxim was in possession of Dracula's remains, a wicked spirit was born after he came in contact with them, and is now possessing him. The castle that you've been wandering through is a creation of both Maxim's will and the power of Dracula's remains made manifest, and that there are two layers to this castle to embody both spirits. So you're probably wondering, why did Maxim have Dracula's remains in the first place? Because he thought that if he resurrected Dracula before he rises naturally in another 50 years and then vanquished him himself, that he'd be seen as a legendary hero alongside the Belmonts. The two layers I mentioned ties into the gameplay, as similarly to Symphony of the Night, there are two castles to explore here. Though, unlike Symphony, it isn't just the same castle with the same aesthetics cheaply flipped upside down. Which is good because, to put it bluntly, I personally found that to be a really stupid design choice. The layouts in this Castle B are the same, yes, but the enemies are different and the stages themselves take on a more ephemeral and otherworldly design. Kinda similarly to how Konami's own Silent Hill series tackles its other world, but not as extreme. Some areas may take on a different approach to their progression, such as one area's Castle A version being more puzzle-focused, and its Castle B version having more enemies. And there will be times where you'll need to backtrack between both castles in order to advance the plot. If this sounds daunting, the game allows you to compare both castles' maps at the same time to see where you've been and haven't been, and which areas in what castle need to be explored further. Searching both castles is how you'll find all 6 of Dracula's remains, many of which are fairly easy to find, but one in particular is hidden in such a dumb way that you'll basically need a walkthrough to find it. Get it? Walkthrough. In fact, the only real challenge of the game may come from trying to figure out where to go, or how to get the game's best ending if you don't already know. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but now I feel is a good time to really go into more detail of just how easy this game is. It may actually be a little too easy for some. Konami may have heard the complaints about how hard Circle of the Moon was and wanted the next game to be easier, but in doing so, I feel like they may have overcorrected themselves and made the game too easy as a result. You're given so many tools to fight enemies efficiently that they don't really stand a chance against you. Hell, even the bosses, which there are way more of this time around, don't even put up that much of a fight, especially if you rush them with the spell fusion abilities the game gives you, not to mention the easier access to healing items. At one point, I had 40 high potions in my inventory, and I didn't even come close to using all of them. Granted, when you get hit by enemies, there's no post-hit invincibility like there was in the last game, so it can get kind of annoying when enemies combo you, but again, it's hardly an issue to recover from it. I only got a game over one time in the playthrough for this video, and it was only because I wasn't paying attention during a boss fight. After that, I got through the rest of the game with no issue. Heck, even the game's last boss was a pushover with the right spell fusion setup. I used the Crucifix and Windbook setup, and the enemies didn't just melt, they flat out disintegrated. I think I've droned on enough about how easy this game is. I think you get it by now. There is a hard mode you can unlock, but you only get it after you've already beaten the game. And you can always turn the spellbooks off and just use the sub-weapons like normal if you're looking for a little bit more of a challenge. Beating the game with any of the 3 endings unlocks a boss rush mode, where you can tackle the game's boss fights in a sequential order. And if you enter the Konami code at the Konami logo before selecting the boss rush mode, that unlocks... why ruin the surprise? In addition to that, beating the game once and starting a new game with the username Maxim unlocks a mode where you get to play as Maxim. He's faster than Juiced and has a triple jump, but he can't level up, use items or spells, equip armor or accessories, or use the merchant. You can only heal yourself either at save rooms or by entering a series of directions on the D-pad to use a move that uses up 50 hearts every time you use it. There's also no story-related content in this mode, so more than anything, it's just an extra little thing thrown in for the fun of it. And I think that's a word I would use to describe Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance. It's a fun game. Granted, it's so easy you can not only break the game, you could snap it in half, but it does still manage to do the Metroidvania search action gameplay so well that I can still easily recommend it. It's a very entry-level game, but I'm of the opinion that a game can be entry-level and still be enjoyable and worth playing if its gameplay is done well. It's beginner-friendly enough that I can recommend it as anyone's first Castlevania, but the next game after this one does even more with the formula, and is more of a challenge, that I may actually recommend that one first over this one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The next time we revisit Castlevania, I'll tell you all about it. When last we met, we took a look at the second of the 3 titles for the Game Boy Advance, Harmony of Dissonance. While it definitely wasn't the toughest game in the series, it did make several quality of life improvements over its predecessor, Circle of the Moon, that made it a smoother experience overall that I can still easily recommend checking out if you haven't already. Unfortunately, that smoother experience and the glowing critical reception didn't translate into the strongest of sales for the sophomore GBA entry, selling only about 300,000 copies, give or take, worldwide. A sharp decline from the previous game's 1 million plus. Despite this, though, the game was still a commercial success in North America, where it enjoyed most of its sales, so the series was allowed to continue on the following year. In fact, the year 2003 would see 2 games, the PS2 exclusive Lament of Innocence, and the topic of this review, Aria of Sorrow, the 3rd and final installment on the Gameboy Advance. Once again developed by Konami's Tokyo studio, responsible for the previous game, Harmony of Dissonance, and what many consider the crown jewel of the series, Symphony of the Night. And also, once again, the footage you're seeing is from the Nintendo Wii U eShop version. This game does something that the series has never done before. Take place in the future. Or at least the future when it was released. Give it another decade or so and this game will be set in the past too. Anyway, the year is 2035 and we join our protagonist, 18-year-old Japanese high school student Soma Cruz. The game says he's a transfer student studying abroad in Japan, but this is actually a mistranslation. He's visiting the family shrine of his best friend Mina Hakuba during a solar eclipse when suddenly, the two of them are, without warning, transferred to a strange castle. It's revealed by the mysterious government agent Genya Arikado that the two of them are inside the castle of the one and only Count Dracula, which was sealed inside of this solar eclipse. But before Soma can get any more answers, they are attacked by a large group of monsters, and when Soma kills the last remaining one, he absorbs the soul of that monster and gains its power. Setting foot in Dracula's castle appears to have awakened a new power within Soma that he's gone his whole life never knowing he had, the power of dominance, or the power to use the abilities of Dracula's monsters. I'll touch on that in greater detail later. Soma is directed by Arikado to find the Master's Chambers of the castle if he wants to get Mina and himself back to Earth, and this is where the game begins. In addition to Arikado, you'll also meet up with a few new characters. One with a very familiar name if you're a fan of this series. A member of the church named Yoko Belnades, a very, very distant descendant of Sypha Belnades from Castlevania 3, or the Netflix series. Before you run into her, though, you meet another guy who managed to find his way inside the solar eclipse named Graham Jones, who looks like he can be completely trusted and is totally not gonna be the villain later, trust me. And later, we meet a mysterious man who goes only by Jay. He can't remember his real name because he was involved in an accident in the year 1999, which gave him amnesia. But he becomes fearful when the name Dracula is uttered, so he's come to Dracula's castle to essentially jog his memory, as he feels Dracula himself might have been involved. But if I go into more detail into that, I'll be going into spoiler territory, so I'll save that for later. Don't worry, I'll give you a heads up if you don't want to be spoiled. Alright, so if you've played Symphony of the Night, or hell, any of the other games that came after that, then you already know exactly what to expect here. Side-scrolling action, monster slaying, and the occasional platform jumping, all across a sprawling castle with varied environments, sometimes needing to acquire a special ability to progress further or access a previously unreachable level in an earlier one, all while battling monsters to gain experience points to level up, and equipping armor and accessories to boost your stats. Though, unlike the previous 2 GBA games, you won't be using a whip as your only weapon this time around. Taking a page from Symphony, you'll have access to a whole host of different weapons, including 1- and 2-handed swords, both of the short and long varieties, lances, hammers, punching weapons, there's even a couple of different handguns in the game. Don't get too excited, the one found in the game's normal mode is literally the single weakest weapon in the whole game. But still, seeing a regular-ass pistol in a Castlevania game is pretty surreal. There may not be any regular whips this time around, but you do happen across some sort of Wit Sword, and it's actually a pretty useful early game weapon. The major thing to take into account is that there are weapons that are swung horizontally, like the short and long swords and the lances, and ones that are swung vertically, like great swords and hammers. They vary from attack power, reach, and speed, so all of these need to be taken into account when you equip them. Would you rather attack quickly at a reasonable range at the cost of a little bit of attack power, or would you rather do a lot of damage at short range at a reduced speed? And there are also some weapons that have elemental effects, which, you guessed it, can deal more damage to enemies of certain elemental alignments. I forgot to bring this up when I looked at Harmony of Dissonance, but many enemies have an element that they're aligned with, and attacking with the opposite element will do extra damage. So yeah, Pokemon rules are in play there. But the real major shakeup with this installment is the introduction of what the game calls the Tactical Soul system. Whenever you slay an enemy, there's a chance their soul will be released, and once acquired, you'll have access to a special ability when that soul is equipped. So yeah, you familiar with that shard system in Bloodstained Ritual of the Night? Yeah, it's literally the exact same idea here. That concept originated here. There are 4 types of souls. The red ones are called bullet souls, which allow you to use some kind of special attack when pressing up on the D-pad and pressing the attack button. The sub-weapons from the previous games are replaced with these bullet souls, instead using your MP meter rather than a separate heart counter. Then you have your blue ones, which are called guardian souls, which you activate by pressing the right shoulder button. These ones can grant abilities like protective force fields, slowing your descent, or any other kind of effect that can help protect you, as long as you have the MP to spare. Then there's the yellow Enchanted Souls, which, when equipped, will provide a consistent passive skill like a stat increase or an ability to walk underwater that does not require MP to use. And finally, the silver Ability Souls, which can be found in these little containers and, on occasion, a specific enemy, and they grant you new abilities like the double jump, the slide, and the backdash, which are needed to access new places you otherwise couldn't reach and further explore the castle. These are, effectively, what replaced the relics from the previous 2 games. Every monster in the game has an equipable soul, though the drop rate on a lot of them are a lot lower than others, so if you're after a particular enemy's soul, you'll more than likely find yourself killing that same enemy over and over and over again until you finally get it. Though that's not to say you won't find some super useful and powerful skills just by playing the game normally. There's a lot of variety in both the weapons and the tactical soul system, and it can lead to a pretty wide range of experimentation. Combining this with the extensive arsenal, I feel like everybody's going to be playing this game just a little bit differently. You're sure to find a few favorite weapons and souls. One neat feature this game has is the ability to trade souls with another player via the soul trade function. Think of it like trading Pokemon. There I go, mentioning Pokemon again. Where you and a friend who also owns the game can trade via the link cable in case one of you is having a hard time finding a particular soul. I never used it personally, but I figured it was worth mentioning anyway. I find that this game really hits that sweet spot in terms of its difficulty. It's not the most brutally hard game in the series, but it will give you a pretty decent challenge this time around. The game's difficulty seems way more gradual this time around. It eases you into it before hitting you with the harder areas with the tougher enemies and bosses later on, as a good game should. On that note, unlike Harmony, you can't stockpile healing items this time around. You're only allowed to carry up to 9 of a certain type of item at any given time. But on the plus side, the game's shop, which is run by a former army soldier named Hammer, is located in exactly one spot throughout the whole game, so you can't miss him. He's literally at the entrance of the castle that's easy to get back to once you've unlocked the teleport rooms. Overall, it just feels like a more balanced game. I never felt like I had to level grind, but I still felt like I needed to be on my toes at all times. As you might imagine, the later levels can definitely get harder, but I never found them frustratingly so. There is a level about halfway through the game that does try to trip you up by having the exits warp you to other parts of the level, but this is the only time the game ever does that, and the level itself isn't very big either. The only other major area that may give players some trouble is the seemingly obligatory clock tower level, with its moving platforms and Medusa heads that fly across the screen, the golden ones turning you to stone, but this level is more annoying than hard. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the levels later. I've got more I want to say about them. I think now's a good time to talk about the thing that I'm sure you've long noticed by now, the visuals. Or rather, the aesthetics in general. I stand by my statement that the Castlevanias on GBA are among the best looking games on the system, and Aria is definitely no exception. The character and enemy sprites are noticeably smaller than they were in Harmony, but the backgrounds still look very detailed for a sprite-based game. Just maybe not as much previously. The game is still very capable of some impressive-looking special effects, though. Soma's running animation is the smoothest and most detailed protagonist animation in the whole GBA trilogy. And the enemies animate pretty well too, for the most part. Maybe not so much the supporting cast, but you're not going to be seeing them walking all that often anyway. Though the sprite sizes may have been scaled down from last time, this does come with a positive effect. The game's music now sounds more full and less like an 8-bit NES game. And of course, since this is a Castlevania game, the music is fantastic. Lots of new personal favorites here. Konami Tokyo found that balance of having good graphics that are easy to see on a GBA screen, I presume, and having a good quality soundtrack to go with it. They even managed to squeeze in some voice samples here and there. Granted, it's all in Japanese, so I don't know what they're saying, but it's there. It was in Harmony of Dissonance too, which is impressive considering they had to cut down the audio quality of that game so much. So, with the visuals being so good for a GBA game, that of course means that the levels themselves are quite lovely to look at as well. Despite the game taking place in the year 2035, the castle itself hasn't had an interior decorator inside of it since at least the early 1900s. That goth aesthetic is still very much strong here, and it leads to some very good-looking areas. One of my personal favorites is the inner quarters, where you run into these maid enemies that'll bow before attacking you. The combination of the way this level looks and the song that plays over it leads to an environment that looks both cozy and dangerous at the same time. The boss fight here against the Headhunter is probably my favorite one of the whole game. You walk into this room with shelves full of severed heads, and the boss has 3 phases, one with a different kind of head, that are all totally unique from each other. Another one of my favorites from an aesthetic standpoint is the floating garden. I'm a really big fan of the dark blue color scheme used here in this level. This is the level that throws that dirty trick at you by having some of the exits lead to different rooms if you enter them a certain way, but again, this is the only level that ever does that, and once you figure out the pattern, it's not bad at all. One part of the game that really stuck out to me was in the short underground cemetery portion right before the boss fight with the Legion. The game's music just stops playing, and you find yourself in a room full of these walking corpses that you can't interact with. It's this really unsettling scene where you just see them walking off screen and making really uncomfortable groaning noises. Like, this one short couple of rooms genuinely skeeved me out. Where the game will really start to kick your ass is when you're nearing the last quarter. The arena level throws some really tough enemies at you, and there are some optional accessories you can grab from these rooms next to the elevator, but oh boy, do these levels want you dead. Now, granted, you don't have to get these particular items, but they will prove to be a big help if you do. Hell, I was only able to grab one of them without dying. And then when you get to the Master's Chambers finally, yeah, now we're kind of starting to get into spoiler territory now. And I don't usually spoil or discuss the endings of the games I play, but since this one ties into the gameplay and the effect it may have on one's ability to get the game's true ending, I'm gonna go ahead and just discuss all of the game's big revelations and discuss the endings. So, if you don't want to be spoiled on an almost 20-year-old game, you can go ahead and just use this time code right here to skip ahead past all the spoilery stuff. Right? We good? Okay, so here's the plot. Let's start back with that Graham Jones fella. Early in the game, Yoko tells you to be wary of him because he believes that he will inherit Dracula's powers from this castle. You later find out from Graham himself that the reason he thinks so is because in 1999, he was born the exact moment that Dracula was destroyed permanently. And because of that, he believes himself to be the reincarnation of Dracula. On that note, how ballsy is it for a series to permanently kill off its major recurring antagonist after so many games? That'd be like if the Legend of Zelda series permanently killed off Ganon. Anyway, later on you find out that Jay has managed to regain his memories completely, and he reveals to Soma his full name, Julius Belmont, the as of now currently last known Belmont, and that he was the one who landed the finishing blow that destroyed Dracula for good back in 1999. His whip, the vampire killer, sealed away inside the castle to prevent Dracula's return. The game alludes to a big huge battle that took place in the year 1999 that destroyed Dracula permanently, and it seems like it would have been a great game in its own right, but it never happened. Fans of the series are still clamoring for this game based on what's called the Demon Castle War. So if you hear fans talking about something called the Battle of 1999 or just the 1999 game, this is what they're referring to. Everything comes to a head when you run into Graham in the underground reservoir, stabbing Yoko. Luckily, Arikado is nearby and manages to get Yoko to safety while Soma chases Graham to the Master's Chambers in the castle's top floor. Yeah, who would have thought that the character named after Billy Graham and Jim Jones would be the villain? Now, throughout the game, you may have picked up at least one of these ancient books. These are hints as to what monster's souls you need to have equipped onto you when you go and fight Graham in the Master's Chambers. You don't need to have all 3 books, but you do have to have all 3 souls equipped onto you during the first phase of the fight, or else the game will lock you into this sort of false ending. I'm just gonna go ahead and tell you so you don't wander around lost like I did the first time I played this game. It's the Giant Bat, Flame Demon, and Succubus souls you need. You'll more than likely already have them just from playing the game normally, but the game doesn't tell you you have to have them all equipped at the same time in order to get the game's true ending. Also, I just want to comment on the third phase of the fight here. He turns into this friggin' thing. If I'd have seen this when I was younger, this for sure would have given me nightmares. When you have all 3 souls equipped and you finish Graham off, Soma absorbs all of the dark energy that Graham was holding on to, which causes Soma to make a startling discovery: that he is the reincarnation of Dracula. Soma's soul and Dracula's powers are one and the same, and if Soma doesn't want it to overtake him completely and have him become the new de facto Dracula, then he'll need to cut off the source of chaos that's influencing the evil spirit within him. Wherein you'll go to the game's real last level, but not before having a tough fight against Julius, who's surprisingly still agile for being well into his 50s. This final stage is pretty short, but it's pretty cool to see that it's composed largely of pieces of previous levels inside of a monochrome void world. But you're going to want to make sure you're prepared and loaded up on as many healing items as you can get before trying to tackle the final boss. Don't make the same mistake I did and not go back and buy healing items after the fight with Julius. The first phase of this 2-phase fight has you at a disadvantage because it strips you of all the souls you've acquired up to this point, and you have to destroy all 3 of these little container things to get them back. All the while, a bunch of visual garbage is thrown at you, and it gets to a point where the hardest part of it all is just trying to keep track of all the crap flying at you. Also, if you die at any point during this boss fight, not only does it give you this admittedly pretty cool bad ending, but you have to sit through an unskippable credits roll, so if you're actually making an effort to beat the boss, you're gonna want to make sure you're geared up proper. Oh boy, that was a long segment. But it all does pose an interesting question. Had the mainline, non-spin-off Castlevania series continued past 2008 with Igarashi-sensei still in charge, where would the series have gone after this point? Well, there were more mainline games under his leadership after this. Actually, you know what? This is probably a topic for its own video. Now, to sum it all up, in case I haven't made it clear enough already, if I had to pick which of the 3 GBA Vanias is the best, even with Circle of the Moon being the closest to my heart personally, and with how much more accessible Harmony of Dissonance is, I can still very easily say that Aria of Sorrow is the best of the 3, hands down. Not just for the amount of experimentation and playstyle?
Ha 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 ha! You are no match for my style!
Not just for the amount of experimentation and playstyle choices this game allows, but it feels like the most balanced and polished of the 3 as well. This game will probably take you somewhere in the ballpark of 8 to 9 hours to get to the end. For me, the playthrough for this video took me about 5.5. Beating the game unlocks hard mode and an optional mode where you get to play as Jay. Only thing is, there's not really any story content, and you can't use the shop, or use healing items, or even pause the game. So yeah, have fun with that. This game is often placed right alongside Symphony of the Night as one of the absolute best the series has to offer. And in my personal opinion, I'd say Aria even surpasses Symphony, and is a must-play if you love Metroidvanias, or if you're just looking for a rock-solid side-scrolling action-adventure with RPG elements. I would just advise against trying to get a physical copy because those prices are just unacceptably high. Thank God for that Advance collection. Actually, you know what? I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention the Advance collection, which was released back in 2021, so let's take a quick look at that. The Castlevania Advance collection is exactly what it sounds like. A collection of all 3 GBA titles released together on one, well, collection. And I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. This is the best and cheapest way of playing these 3 games today. On top of having these 3 already great games on one collection, the game also keeps track of a few things that make gameplay much more helpful. In Circle of the Moon, it'll keep track of what enemies have what DSS card and if you have them already or not. Same with the souls in Aria of Sorrow. And yes, the DSS glitch in Circle of the Moon is still there. Though the soul trade is straight up removed from this collection. This handy little pop-up will help you keep track of all of that, but if you find it too distracting, you can always turn it off. The Advance collection also has the usual extras and quality of life implementations like an art gallery, a music player, save states, different options for your screen display, and an ability to rewind gameplay in case you make a mistake. And for only $20, you're getting all of that, plus 3 of the GBA's best games. And Dracula X. Yeah, the pared-down Super Nintendo port of Rondo of Blood, the original of which was only included in the PS4 exclusive Requiem collection with Symphony. I don't even know why that's the way it is. From what I've played so far, Dracula X is fine. But if I want a Super Nintendo Castlevania, personally, I'll just play Super Castlevania 4. But I'm just glad this collection exists, because now these games are all more readily available without breaking the bank. These are some of my personal favorite games, as I've rather exhaustively gone over, and I'm just so glad that more people can easily play them now. The next collections I want to see made would be for the DS Trilogy, and for the 2 PS2 games, which I think are worth playing. Here's hoping that a collection for at least the DS games gets made someday, because those games are way too good to be trapped on dead hardware. Oh, and if you're wondering if I'm going to cover those games in the future, the answer is yes, someday. Hopefully by then Konami will have announced a collection for those games, but I guess for now we'll just have to wait and see. In the meantime, I think I'm about tapped out on Castlevania. I really hope you enjoyed my look back on this particular section of the series. Let me know in the comments which Castlevania game is your favorite and why. I'll see you all in the next one, and as always, thanks for watching.